Hello, I'm Michael Kraft, and on behalf of the Omega staff and community, welcome to today's Omega conversation with Pádraig Ó Tuama, entitled Living Your Life in the Company of Poetry. Before we start, a word about Omega during these challenging times. Like so many of you, the impact of COVID has been profound and often difficult for us, but we've endured and hopefully are better for it. Omega remains dedicated to its mission of serving healing and transformation for individuals and society, but we can only do so with your continued support. In addition to the generosity of our speakers, free Omega conversations like this are made possible in part by generous members like you. To learn more about how you can join Omega's nonprofit mission, please visit eomega.org and look at Become a Member. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. We'll begin by discussing his work, and later in the hour, we'll take questions from viewers by using the raise hand option in reactions at the bottom of your toolbar. I am so proud to welcome Pádraig Ó Tuama, a visionary poet, activist, and theologian from Ireland, whose work centers around themes of language, poetry, conflict, religion, and beauty. His poetry has received acclaim in circles of literature, psychology, politics, and theology. He's been published in many places, including the Harvard Review, Poetry Ireland, and the Academy of American Poets. Pádraig hosts the Poetry Unbound podcast from the On Being Project, which was downloaded more than 3 million times in 2020. His books include readings from the Book of Exile, Sorry for Your Troubles, In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World, and Borders and Belonging. A book edition of Poetry Unbound is forthcoming in October with a new poetry collection expected in 2023. Pádraig is a member and former leader of the Corrymeela community, which is Ireland's oldest reconciliation community, and I hope he'll tell us about that. Pádraig, welcome.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's lovely to be with you, and it's lovely to see everybody's name and where they're from. You'll hear the sounds of 2nd Avenue in New York City here. It isn't somebody else with their microphone unmuted, so I'm sorry, but much and all as I try to hope that people on the street would turn their sirens off, I imagine they're unlikely to listen to me. So it's lovely to be with you.
Thank you, Pádraig. Pádraig, for a lot of people, we see poetry as something remote that only published poets do, but you seem to have been an ambassador for poetry to many different communities. Could you tell us a little bit about that kind of poetry and how you see poetry in light of that?
Well, I mean, it's best told with a story. When I was 16, I think, I was sitting at the back of chemistry class and I wasn't very good at chemistry. And so my friend was next to me and he had just broken up with his girlfriend and they'd been together for 6 months, which when you're 16 was a very long time. And I was friends with both of them. And the fact that they'd broken up, introduced all kinds of things to a 16-year-old to figure out, how do I deal with the awkwardness of that? Of course, these things continue into adulthood. But I noticed in the back of his chemistry book, he was writing a poem. I obviously didn't read it, but I could see from the shape of what he was writing that it was in, 4-line verses in quatrains. And that somehow in the midst of his 16-year-old heartbreak, what he needed to do was to turn to a kind of incantatory language that had form and shape, and in a certain sense put his own devastation and heartbreak into conversations with other poems in the world. And that really, I've been writing poetry all my life, I suppose since I was 11, maybe to be more accurate. But seeing my friend next to me turn to a poem, and he wasn't interested in poetry. He went on to become a scientist. He wasn't interested in poetry, but he needed poems. And as far as I'm concerned, everybody will turn to a poem at some point in their life. And I just hope that it's good enough. A time of grief, a time of joy, a time of change. And there is a way within which poetry is interested in the lives of the people who need it. And therefore, poetry has a certain kind of part of a conversation with the human condition. It's lovely that you use the word ambassador. I feel like I'm one part of a city full of people, all of whom love poetry and know that poetry turns to the world with curiosity about the world.
That's wonderful. You spoke about poetry as if poems are living beings. So do you see it that way, that we are in the company of a poem in different times in our life, like it's a mirror of ourselves or a friend or a teacher?
It can be all those things. poetry is alive in a way that somebody could have written something like, for instance, Shakespeare wrote this sonnet to his mistress. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. And it's a long exercise in hyperbole. He's saying how ordinary she is until he then, in the last two lines, turns and kind of says, he kind of highlights that he's just been kind of critiquing the imagination about what perfection is. So the idea that Instagram is to blame for imaginations of perfection is a limited imagination. So therefore, what we have is a conversation between Shakespeare and the question of social media. And in a way, what he was doing is speaking to the deeply primal in us when it comes to the question of the relationship about why love and why love here, and how to respond to ways within which the world often has the wrong measurements for what the question of love and beauty really means. And therefore, it's alive because it goes much beyond the circumstances of his life. You don't even need to know who his mistress was or who was writing the damn poem, because you can find a way within which that poem is in conversation today with a question about, how do I feel about who I see when I look in the mirror? So therefore, I see it as alive in that way. And often I think the poem knows regularly much more than the poet does. And the poem has its own intelligence and intuition. And for me, the invitation is to find a way to sit quietly with a poem and to let the intuition and the wisdom and the intelligence of that poem be in conversation with the circumstances of my own life.
You say sit quietly with. A lot of us have the impression that poetry is part of an inner reflective process that often uses stillness or silence. Is that correct?
And that's one of the ways, absolutely. There's certain poems that would be difficult to read on a bus with lots of noise. But then there's other poems that would be perfect to read on a bus with lots of noise, because maybe the poem is a highly populated poem and the poem helps you look up and around. I was doing a poetry workshop with 15-year-olds in a public school in New York City. And I said, we're going to do a little exercise in the question of observation and just looking at what you can see. Don't try to turn it into a metaphor. Don't try to turn it into a simile. Just tell me what you see. And so I said, tell me about the subway. I think the New York subway is a magnificent feat of public transportation. The 15-year-olds were all like, my God, it's filthy. What are you on about? So anyway, I said to them, kind of as an act of revenge, well, I want you to write poems of observation about the subway, because they all rode the subway to school. And one of them, she wrote this line that says, boys looking at girls they have no hope with, no chance with. And I thought it was a magnificent observation about what 15-year-olds see about other 15-year-old boys and checking somebody out. And I just thought her observation was genius. And that was a few years ago. And I still remembered the line. I met her teacher last night, actually, the teacher who'd invited me into the class. And I said to him, I have continued to reflect on that magnificently crafted line that a 15-year-old came up with spontaneously. And so therefore, sometimes a poem needs deep silence and deep reflection, but other times a poem actually can be noisy and can be populated in the same way that human communities at times require reflection, at other times are filled with population. I think a poem can be all along that spectrum as well.
You mentioned community. It's the subtitle of your book, In the Shelter, is Finding a Home in the World. And doesn't poetry help us find home and also community?
Well, I hope that poems help you find the community of yourself. And by using that word community, what I mean is the plural of yourself. Just because a poet writes a poem and speaks off by saying, I am, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the poet writing about themselves. In a certain sense, every poem is an echo of a bigger poem, and every poem is the possibility of recognizing different parts of yourself. A persona poem, for instance, can bring you into writing from the point of view of a character from fiction, or maybe a great-great-grandparent. But the question for me is, even though it's not you, nonetheless, you have been drawn to write from the eye of that person. And that means that there is a connection somehow. And what is that connection? And what is the part of you that does actually connect with that historical or fictional character that you're writing on behalf of? And therefore, you're brought into the community of your own imagination. And then I hope, of course, that poetry also creates a community of readers and writers and listeners and enjoyers of that, of course. But I think the first community to encounter is the community of yourself, in the hope that that can open you up to the extraordinary differences and tensions and conflicts that you can find in the community of others as well.
Tensions and conflicts are exactly that. A lot of us, when we look inside, we see things that you would refer to as the shadow. And you talk a lot about that in your books. Say something about shadow as part of the inner life and how we can own the shadow, or some say eat your shadow. How does poetry help us do that?
Well, the word in Irish for shelter and shadow is the same. Irish isn't unique in that. And often shelter can be seen as something that you would seek out, perhaps because you need it, and shadow might be associated with a negative experience. I suppose I want to say that neither of those are positive or negative. They're both just real. There's a phrase really that whole book In the Shelter is written around. And the phrase is an old saying or a proverb in Irish. And the saying is, sco a chéile a waras na daoine, sco a chéile a waras na daoine. And that means it is in the shelter of each other that the people live. But because the word shelter can mean shadow, it can also mean it's in the shadow of each other that the people live. Wow. And therefore, I look at any community that seeks to provide belonging, Omega, Farimila, a church, a faith community, a yoga club, wherever. And I think it always, this proverb, this saying, reminds us that what is sheltering for some will be shadowing for others. And what some people will feel deeply drawn to join, other people will feel deeply drawn to leave. And that both of those have the quality of integrity to them. It can be the same in a family. You can have different members of a family. One of them says, oh, I can't wait for Thanksgiving. It'll be such a relief to be around everybody. And other people are saying, I can't wait until Thanksgiving is over. And these could all have been, it could be the same person saying that, as well as it could be two siblings or a couple or etc. You understand? And I think the wisdom of this imagination is to recognize that our experiences too can be more than one thing, and to find a way to name that. And sometimes naming it actually decreases the pressure to try to name it as it'll be lovely or it'll be terrible. To say it'll be a mixture of things and let's see how it is, rather than I know exactly how it will be. And that, I think, is an invitation into being present to the moment. That does take a certain kind of courage and a certain kind of poetics of attention to name what it's being like at the moment.
I love that. We live in a time when there's so many divisions and so much polarization, and communities aren't always as strong as they should be. A lot of communities are under threat or marginalized. You live as an activist and a poet in the world. You are an outspoken supporter of legalization for same-sex marriage and an opponent of conversion therapy. And I'm sure in a conservative society, you've taken a lot of criticism for that. But that, to me, merges your spirituality, your poetry, and your activism. And you've talked so eloquently about that in the past. What's going on in that realm right now in Ireland? I remember a lot of us are very curious about that.
Yeah. Well, for me, like conflict, theology, and poetry all come together in the imagination of language and the imagination of public words and how we use public words. And I suppose I have a standard that I hope anybody who was going to use their words in public would hold themselves to, whether they're a clergy person in a religious group, whether they're a politician standing for or holding office, whether they're an artist, whether they're a broadcaster, whether they're a spokesperson for some kind of concern, that there could be the possibility of saying, even in the midst of disagreements, let's find a way to make our words work better than what they do, rather than manipulative rhetoric that you sometimes hear, or utterly predictable language. Sometimes I turn on the radio and they say, we have this person and they're going to debate. And I think, sure, I could turn off the radio now and write out the entire script in advance. That bores me. And it's dangerous as well, but it also bores me. And I'm interested in language being surprising, where somebody asks a question and I think, what on earth are they going to say? And not because they've been cornered, but because something interesting has happened, something curious and something creative. And so for me, the power of language is the possibility of people listening to that thinking, what are they going to say next? And that is what I hold out for in the hope of public exchange of language. And so when it comes to the question of this, the safety and the structural recognition that LGBT people have been part of every society around the world for all the time, whatever names we use for ourselves, hidden or not, I am interested in the possibility of truth and integrity in the way we speak about our lives in public. I think it's safe to say that the world has been a conservative place when it comes to LGBTI people. You know, Ireland has a particularity of that, but I went through reparative therapy. I was forced through it, and most of the people who were giving that stuff had trained in this country, that in the United States. Often a country that likes to see itself as progressive while other places might be more historically traditional. That's not the case at all. New York and Toronto were the biggest training centers for reparative therapy. So the idea that a metropolitan, forward-looking, buzzing city is necessarily accompanied by safety and progressivism, I think that is a certain kind of bias against rural or traditional communities, where you might actually find something that is much more safe and systemically capable of asking a deeper question. So Ireland has changed. You know, there was a popular vote in the Republic for the legalization of same-sex marriage, which was on the one hand magnificent, but nobody should be voting on the rights of other people as to whether they have the rights. So I recognize that it was a good thing, but even that cause for great celebration caused a lot of pain, because the national broadcaster was mandated to have what could be called balanced arguments in the 6 or 7 months leading up to it. So a lot of hate was broadcast while people made all kinds of allegations about LGBT people, allegations which regularly went unchallenged because the radio stations were desperate to be seen to be balanced. So in a certain sense, they amplified all kinds of things which were problematic, even in the name of trying to have broadcasting integrity in the lead into something as monumental as that vote. There is, you know, in both jurisdictions of Ireland, there are calls for reparative therapies to be banned. And I think that's a really good thing. The problem in any jurisdiction, I know New York is doing the same thing. The problem in any jurisdiction trying to ban that is that the people who are doing it usually aren't affected by the bans. They're usually not accredited therapists who are doing it. They're people who are kind of self-appointed counselors with no professional accreditation, who are doing it maybe as healing prayer within the context of a faith community. And they're not bothered by the idea that, you know, formally accredited therapists are banned from doing this. And in fact, sometimes I think they feel bolstered up by the fact that, oh yeah, you know, our point of view is being challenged, and therefore there's a certain cornering that happens. To me, the deeper question is always, do you believe that LGBT people in couples are capable of love? And therefore, that's the question, rather than somebody saying, oh, I don't do reparative therapy, I do curing prayer, or I accompany people with unwanted same-sex attractions. All of this obfuscation of language is an utter lie. The question is always, do you believe that LGBT couples are capable of love? And from that comes all kinds of hells that are created when people say no. They therefore make all kinds of shit up in order to justify what they think is justifiable at the expense of people like me who are forced through exorcisms and reparative therapies. And for this, I need the sharp precision of language to be able to speak in public about this. And poetry has helped.
Well, thank you. And I had no idea, and that is profoundly disturbing. And yet that's the shadow. It's a shadow of a society, our society, clearly.
One of them.
One of them. The shadow is so dark and so great. There's so many, you talk about, you can't balance when there's hate. And so there's a lot of hatred out there of so many kinds. You know, we live in a time when, for most of us, for years now, we've lost faith in institutions, faith in traditional authorities, but we don't have often that inner guidance that gives us the confidence we might have had in an earlier time. And so people are looking for something to believe in.
Yeah.
And many of us here at Omega and in our community believe that it's about raising consciousness and finding that guidance within. But how do you blend that and how do you blend love and compassion with activism in the world rather than retreat? And so you seem to be very involved in that. And I'm curious, I think a lot of our listeners would be very glad to hear what you think about the merging of activism and inner life.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should say that trying to live, and I never use the word activist for myself. I mean, if other people want to call me that, that's fine. I suppose for me, the question is what is the work in front of me to do? And some of that is art, and some of that is trying to make a living, some of that is writing, and some of that is speaking. A, to confess where I've been the problem, and B, to name in situations where it's appropriate where I think the problem is. So I suppose for me, it's a call to integrity, and that is both artistic and public. And in the shape of that, there are multiple ways of being at different times. You know, a few years ago, I was in a time of deep grief. Somebody had died very close to me, and it really plummeted me into a situation where any public words were overwhelming. And so I never think that there's one shape for how people should try to be present to a world of integrity. The question is the community doing? And in the community, there's going to be some people who can support from the sidelines, some people who can be public, some people who can do the research, some people who can support. And hopefully then all of those positions can move and change as appropriate, you know. As a community thinks about how is it that we take the shape of that. What often happens in leftist communities, I think, is that we do the work of our opponents for us, because there's going to be some people who say, my God, that person's always talking, or that person does nothing, or that person does this, or that person does that. They think that research will answer it all. They think that art will answer it all. And therefore we splinter and fracture and actually do the entire work of dismantling the cohesion of our public message for the people who are absolutely delighted, because therefore they're not being challenged. They can say, look how fragmented they are. They've got no unity together to be able to speak. And so for me, it's the multiple and shifting shapes for what a community of activism looks like, and how we attend to the tidal movements of that experience together as a community that says our actual aim is to make an increase in the safety of people in this system according to this particular measurement. And therefore, with that, the question for me is, can I help by research? Can I help by promoting? Can I help by amplifying somebody's voice? How can I help? Can I help by saying something myself, or by shutting up and not finding myself being brought into a self-defeating approach? So I think that's a really important thing. Like a few years ago, there was a reparative therapy conference in Belfast. It was religiously run, and it rejoiced in the unfortunate title of The Lepers Among Us. And anyway, I had been challenged by the fellow who was running it to say, if you can sit through that, if you dare, I'll give you 15 minutes of reply at the end of a day-long conference. I kind of went along with curiosity to think, I wonder if I'll hear anything new, or if it will be a rehashing of the kinds of stuff I'd heard for 20 years. I brought a friend because I needed support. And I also emailed the people who were organizing the protest outside of that, just to say, you know, I'm going to be going in because I've been told that if I can sit and stand if I can tolerate what's being said about us, that I'll have the possibility of saying something. So I don't know if that's going to make any difference, but I'm willing to give it a go. And so what was helpful is I went and hugged and kissed loads of people in the protest, and then went in. And there was no sense of people saying, you're compromising for going in and engaging. You know, there's multiple shapes for saying what's going to work. And our aim was to find a way where we could expose the toxicity of the imagination of LGBT people that was being presented. And therefore, I think any community that's seeking to resist with language and power something that's dangerous needs to find a way to say, how can we not do the work of our resistors for us? How can we be unified, understanding there are multiple shapes to responding to something that is causing damage?
That's beautiful. Poems sometimes, like, people challenge us, and it's funny how people have different tides of poetry in their life. Poems come and go. You might have a favorite poem for 1 year, and another year it's something completely different. What are your favorite poems and poets right now?
You say it so nicely, Michael. Thanks for saying it like that. Like, I know that poetry can seem intimidating. You know, Strand Bookstore in New York City here in Lenape land is my favorite cathedral in the city. I love going to the poetry bookshelves there. And there's a lot of books of poems. And for somebody who says, look, I like poems, but I don't know where to begin, it can feel a little bit like saying, describe the Atlantic Ocean. And for me, the question isn't to describe the Atlantic Ocean of poetry. It's just to say, go to one strand and enjoy it. And it might be that you read one of the Blood Axe anthologies of poetry, or Ilya Kaminsky edited this most extraordinary echo anthology of world poetry. It's a beautiful place to begin. Or it might be that you say, I have a favorite poet, Lucille Clifton. And do you know what? I'm really happy loving poetry from this strand into the great ocean of poetry. That's a great place to be. And then you might want to, move on to other poets. Or a life lived reading Lucille Clifton is a magnificently accompanied life. You don't have to do anything. And so for me, I suppose the way that poetry rests in me is that I do feel like an ambassador or maybe a tour guide to say to people, here's a lovely shore to stand at for a while in the company of one poem. And here's another, and here's another, and here's another, and here's another. And that is something that I really enjoy helping people with, and finding a way where they know that they can find a couple of doorways into a poem, but also that as they look at a poem is looking back with curiosity, really, about the person who's reading it. And the poem is remade and sometimes reshaped in the company of the person who's reading it. So for me at the moment, let me see, who am I reading? I'm reading a lot of Rilke. Rilke has a long practice of using the word you, and I'm so interested in the word you in poetry and prayer. I find it such an intimate and complex and shape-shifting word, this word you. I've just finished the selections for season 5 of Poetry Unbound, which is coming out next spring. We're currently in season 4 of Poetry Unbound, which is an On Being podcast. And so I've been deep in reading. I suppose I read about 200 books of poetry per season to try to, of the 200, think, how can I choose 24 poems that are going to work? And then to make an arrangement that kind of has a bit of balance and a bit of tension with it in order to curate a season that holds some kind of message together.
That's amazing. We have some questions, but before we go into the questions, I know you had a short practice you wish to lead us in. Could we do that? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the practice is to, I hope you have a pen and paper or something that you want to text into it. You can do it into your phone. And the practice is, I'm going to just give you a minute to start to think about this. If you could give yourself advice about how to be alone with yourself, what would you say? I'll say it again. If you could give yourself advice about how to be alone with yourself, what would you say? Take a minute to just start that. And I'll read a poem slowly that really is advice to myself about how to be alone with myself. I'll leave little gaps between some of the stanzas in order to let a bit of space. I'll give you a minute now in silence and in the company of the traffic going down 2nd Avenue to pay attention to your own advice to yourself. Here's the poem, How to Be Alone. It all begins with knowing nothing lasts forever. So you might as well start packing now. In the meantime, practice being alive. There will be a party where you feel like nobody's paying you attention. And there will be a party where attention's all you get. What you need to do is to remember to talk to yourself between these parties. And again, there will be a day, a decade where you won't fit in with your body, even though you're in the only body you're in. You need to control your habit of forgetting to breathe. Remember when you were younger and you practiced kissing on your arm? You were onto something then. Sometimes harm knows its own healing. There's a you telling you another story of you. Listen to her. Where do you feel anxiety in your body? The chest, the fist, the dream before waking, the head that feels like it's at the top of the swing, or the clutch of gut like falling and falling and falling and falling. It knows something. You're dying. Try to stay alive. For now, touch yourself. I'm serious. Touch yourself. Take your hand and place your hand someplace upon your body and listen to the community of madness that you are. You are such an interesting conversation. You belong here.
Oh, thank you. That's remarkable.
And my hope is that you've been adding to that poem with lines of your own, that you ignored me as I was saying it because you were listening to yourself. The poem might have been in conversation with you and you with it as you wrote advice to yourself about being alone.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I did that. So
Good.
Pádraig, we have some questions. I'm going to ask people who wish to ask a question to raise their hand, and you can do that by going down to the bottom of your toolbar and go to the right where it says reactions, and you can click on that, and it says raise hand, and then we will see your raised hands. So if you have a question for Pádraig, please raise your hand. I'm not seeing any.
See Skylar Wiseman.
Good morning.
Hi, Skylar.
Hello. I'm curious about reading poetry versus saying it out loud.
It's a lovely question, Skylar. What leads you to ask it?
Well, I'm thinking about, and also writing poetry, if you're writing poetry for yourself or if you're writing it for others, and communicating it through written word or oral tradition, which is so strong in Gaelic history also.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm by myself, I will regularly read a poem that I'm reading out loud, as I'm reading a book. Maybe not all of them, but loads of them. Like this morning, I was preparing for this extraordinary book of Sinead Morrissey, who's a Belfast poet who lives in England, on balance. And there were some of the poems that I've read this book before, but as I was rereading it in preparation for something, there were some of them that I just loved so much, I went back and read it out loud. But other times something just works right on the page. So there's no rule about how it should be done. I suppose initially, of course, poetry began as an oral experience because not everybody could read, and the incantation of a poem is often very, very powerful, and people like that. But some poets maybe don't like to read their work, and some poets only want their work to be read, not necessarily on the page. So there's no hard and fast rule about it. The question for me is always, what do you want to do? How do you want to read it? Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Nice to hear your voice.
you see some other raised hands? Let's see.
I did see some questions in the chat as well, so I can address those if nobody's raising their hand.
Well, I can read one of those chat questions. People wanted to know, first off, did you get your 15 minutes at the end at that conference?
Indeed, I did. Yeah. Indeed, I did. So often, one of the ways within which those derogatory imaginations of LGBT people communicate themselves is to speak about us like we're a community of profound depravity, and so all kinds of extreme examples about sad gay men's lives are being communicated. I believe that those are true, but they're not representative. And I believe that you could equally choose sad stories of heterosexual people's lives and posit that as an argument for how sad heterosexuals are. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I used my 15 minutes was to say, my friend who's here is doing a degree by night in law, and he's doing really well. I read poetry every morning because it makes me feel alive. And to find a way where to say the imagination of the sad, depraved lives that you were using to justify your hatred, we resist you back with stories of joy and stories of flourishing. So that's what I did with my 15 minutes, well as wipe the floor with them theologically, which was easy to do because they had made shit up.
That's wonderful. People ask, where can they find the poem you read?
Oh, actually, if you put my name, Pádraig Ó Tuama, and How to Be Alone into YouTube, there's a beautiful video that On Being produced. So you can get, and the full poem is also on the On Being website. So that's where you'll find it.
On Being. Thank you. People also would like to hear more about who are your favorite poets at this time in space, at least.
Marshall has just shared that. Thanks for sharing that, Marshall. Who are my favorite poets at this time? So it's always a shifting question. I read a lot of poetry. So at the moment, the book of poetry that I have not stopped thinking about has been Gail McConnell's book, The Sun is Open. And that is a book-length poem of her responding to what it means to be a woman in her 40s now who has lived all of her life in the aftermath of the murder by her father by the IRA in 1984. And she's a renowned poet in Ireland. And this book-length piece is written almost like it's in newspaper columns. It looks like it's newspaper columns because so much of the archive material that she has about her father, she was 3.5 when he was murdered, so much of the archive material she has is in the form of clippings from newspapers. It's the most magnificent book. So I haven't stopped thinking about Gail's work. I could list 50 poets whose work I'm really enjoying. I'd also name Raymond Antrobus. He just has a new book out, and that book is called All the Names Given, and it's a magnificent exploration of Black Britishness and deafness also. He's a deaf poet, and so it's an extraordinary imagination about language and shape and communication and identity. Lorna Goodison, I will always return to. I think Lorna Goodison is one of my favorite poets. She has a new book out called Mother Muse, and half of the book is about this nun in Jamaica called Sister Iggy. And Sister Iggy loved jazz music and boxing. And so she worked in a home for wayward boys. And Sister Iggy identified and mentored some of Jamaica's most well-known jazz musicians in a home that would have possibly been a difficult experience. She made it a place of extraordinary creativity. So, yeah. So those are some. I'll stop listing. But yeah, Lorna Goodison, Raymond Antrobus, and Gail McConnell are 3 people who I continually return to with love.
Thank you for that. I hadn't heard of any of those, and I've written them down, so I will check them out myself. We have a hand raised from Margaret Cliggott Reynolds. Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi. I'll be honest. My question was about what happened in the 15 minutes. And that was, I asked it about 10 minutes ago. So someone has already addressed that. But well, it just comes to me. I'm going to tell you what I wrote. The answer to your question. I wrote, remember throughout the day to listen in to your soul, the deepest truth of your feeling and your existence in the moment.
Beautiful.
For example, right now, I'm noticing my face in a true smile.
I love that turn at the end. For example, how beautiful. What a lovely thing you've done with time there.
Listening to you. So thank you today for all the inspiration and for your life and all your giving.
Thanks, Margaret. That's kind. Yeah, I love what you did there. For example, that's gorgeous. There's a poem. Who wrote it? I can't remember. And it says, "The world is very big and very round, and in it many things are found. For example, a tree." I love it. I love the way it breaks the form right at the end, for example. When it comes back to the 15 minutes at the end of the conference, I've trained in theology and I have a deep interest in the question about God. I'm not a promoter of belonging to any one religion, but I am a promoter of asking the question about God and considering what prayer might mean. And in the midst of that, I have somewhat of a mantra for being in complicated spaces where the dignity of my life is being discussed. And the mantra is, love the gospel and take no shit. Don't be a dick. So, and in those situations, I try to hold to those three things. Love the gospel, take no shit, don't be a dick.
That's good advice.
Good advice for myself.
I love it.
Peter Owen has his hand up.
Hi, Peter.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
I find this very powerful, what you're saying, because I was very moved indeed by what you said about the shadow. And I think we have an incredible shadow problem in our societies. There's so many things that people won't talk about. By sheer coincidence, a few hours ago, I was listening to Parker Palmer talking about Emily Dickinson. And she had a line, I hope I can quote it correctly, "When you tell the truth, tell it on the slant."
Yeah.
And I thought what she was saying was very powerful. And when I've been to a few poetry readings, I found when you look at the audience, something seems to happen where they go quiet. Now, if you were just reading a text, that wouldn't happen so much. And I'd just be interested in your explorations of in the way that poetry can open people up, where they might actually consider their own shadow and the general social shadow, and really what Nietzsche said, how many of us have the courage for what we really know?
So difficult.
And there's so much that really does need to be said in Western society about where we've got ourselves now, because, it is, I'm not paranoid because there are many good things, but certainly I think we have pretty serious problems that are coming in now. It's slowly dawning on us that the Western model just might not be very healthy.
Yeah, just might not.
Yeah, and so please.
Thanks for your question, Peter. I suppose I like to think sometimes that the shadow and the unconscious have things to say to each other. I don't want to demonize the shadow because I think the shadow often has profound information. And so the question for me is, what's my relationship with the shadow, rather than, how do I flee from it or how do I get rid of it? And in that, I suppose, it's why I'm interested in multiplicities, how I can understand the I as a multiple thing and how I can approach that. And in as much as I say I want to work for peace, how can I also say, well, what's the part of me that is actually being destructive? How can I pay attention to that part of me too? And to not think, it means that I'm an inept, corrupt human being if I come across a part of me that's destructive, but rather think, what is my fascination with destruction in the midst of a desire for peace? And I think that's always going to have to be something that people learn to ask themselves individually and collectively, and therefore to bring that kind of attention to public conversations. And the question for me is, how is it that any people find a way to do that kind of reflection? One of the things you mentioned, Peter, in that you think that there is an attentiveness when a poem is being recited. I agree. I'm just going to use this as an example. So here's a poem by Sinead Morrissey, and you can see that there's the structure of it on the page. And for me, sometimes it's the imagination of the work of the blank space of the page that somehow that's doing its magic in a room. All the things that aren't being said, all the ways within which poetry is honed and uses few words. I just sent off a manuscript of poetry to a publisher for a submission the other week. And I think I've been working on that collection for 10 years. And it's 8,000 words, the entire thing, including title and acknowledgements and table of contents. So 8,000 words in 10 years is not a lot. And therefore, I would hope that it's everything that isn't being said that is being present in a room when people are hearing it. So,
thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. We have another question from D'Angelo Dia.
Yes, it's a twofold question. I hope you can hear me.
I can. Hi, D'Angelo.
Hey, I hope you're doing well today. Thank you for your time. I'm a pastor and a poet, and I'm curious, how do you see integrating poetry? I typically close or open with something poetic. But how do you see the integration semantically of poetry in a way that doesn't feel like an add-on or a tag-on?
Yeah.
And then the second part of that question is, for me, this is very much poetry has been a tool and outlet for social and civic change in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But inevitably, this is going to be a weird question, so I say this not in any disrespect to anyone in this space. Inevitably, whenever I'm in a space like this, if it is a holistic topic or if it's somewhat adjacent to that, I can pretty much surmise what the audience is going to be. But if it is poetry from the lens, and I appreciate that you mentioned Raymond's work, but if it's poetry from the lens of being marginalized a certain way, or if it's used the tool for like sparking discomfort, it often is a community of Black and brown individuals. So how do we holistically truly use this tool to nurture more an inclusive scope where it doesn't always turn into a palette like what we have here?
Yeah, sure. I'm really glad for your questions, both of them, D'Angelo. With regard to the first one, I think what I'm hearing in your question is the question about what does it mean to pay attention to art, not just use art as an add-on, or not just use art as if it only has one purpose. And I suppose I always see that art is unfinished, and art always will yield in surprising things. And so in the context of using art in public, whether that's in preaching, whether that's in a speech that's being given, the question for me is, how can we say more than this is a poem about? It's always, and perhaps say, one of the things this poem is about is the following, and paying attention for all the ways within which the unwritten and the unheard is actually also doing its own work. And as regards the question of communities of people who gather around particular things, will gather around an event like this, for instance, and how a huge majority of people are white, and as you're saying, that's predictable pattern. How do we do that? I don't know is the answer that I have. For me, what I try to do is to read very widely. I will not tolerate any excuse from myself or indeed anyone else who just says, oh, I only just read the poets that I know. They all happen to be white and perhaps all male. To my mind, that is an indication of a choice, even if a person doesn't want to acknowledge it as a choice. So how is it, therefore, that both in my reading and in my speaking about poems, how can I make sure that I'm reading widely and making the choice to read widely and not making the choice to let laziness dictate the question about whose experience do I amplify through the lens of art? And so I think that's how I pay attention. And the question as to who chooses to turn up for something, I'm never entirely sure, because I think sometimes people might choose to turn up for something where they feel like they're going to feel respected. And the question for me isn't that I can dictate who's going to turn up, but how can I make sure that anytime I speak about poetry, I'm demonstrating respect for a wide variety of poets from a wide variety of places, writing about a wide variety of things. For instance, Raymond, who's a good friend as well, just because he's a biracial, deaf British poet, it doesn't mean that he shouldn't be writing poems about flowers, or am I only quoting his poems about being a biracial, deaf British poet? And that too is a certain way where I'm limiting what the work of his poem is doing by only imagining that some of his identities are the things that he's going to write about. I read a lot of Jamaican poetry. So there's a poet, Jason Allen Payson, who's got this extraordinary book about trees. He's moved to England in the last while, and it's about being a Black man walking around forests in England and seeing the treatment of himself walking around forests in England, as if to imply that forests in England usually are for white people to walk around. And he's asking the question about who gets to write nature poems and who gets to imagine what a nature poem is. And in the midst of that, there's also these extraordinary observations of flowers and the shape of a tree after it's died and what it's like to be present in a wood. So that's an answer to saying, I don't know about the question of audience. The standard of responsibility that I hold myself to is in the question of reading and trying to be increasingly better at the question about how I read. So I really thank you for your question, though, Deandra. Do you have anything that you would say is, or to respond to that if you want? I'm curious.
No, I very much appreciate the way you answer that question. And it is affirming of my thoughts and also challenging of them in a good way, in a healthy way. So thank you about the scope and spectrum of what I'm choosing to read. So thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pádraig, we also have a question from our Facebook Live chat.
Oh, lovely.
Someone was asking about the lines in your poem, "You're dying, try to stay alive." And their question is, how do you translate or adapt that for someone who is facing a terminal illness?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious for them to do it. Yeah, those were words given to me as I spoke to myself. To me, the work about that would be to ask the person and to hear what they'd say in response to that. Yeah, I'd like to hear the answer to that question too.
Thank you.
Somebody's asking about that poet. It's Jason Allen Payson.
Jason Allen Payson. Oh, thank you. Payson.
I think I have misspelled one Payson, but anyway, it's there. And Walking with Trees is the name of the book.
Mary Pierce Brosmer has her hand up.
I have two stories, and then the question is probably about the second. I began my vocation as a high school teacher of English, and I taught poetry, writing and poetry, and to a young man at that time who has since, in 2014, he's 57 now, so that says how long ago I started teaching and loved every minute of it. He had a brain stem bleed, and he is now in what is called locked-in condition. And the passion to connect with the world is inside of all of us. And his only way of doing that, because all he can move is this part of his body, is that he has learned to write. He wrote poetry back when he was in high school, and he's a songwriter. And he uses a stylus, and he holds it in his teeth, and he picks out letter by letter on an iPad. And that is how he has written poems. And the intensity of the desire to connect and be heard in the world through is so powerful to me through that. And he has, I'm not selling, but he actually has completed a book called From the Rolling Chair.
Sure, right.
And in the picture of him, you see him contemplating a horizon from the chair that he can, manipulate a bit around the world. And people came together. I proofread the book for him. People came together and raised money, and it's sold on Amazon. And needless to say, he has more people to communicate with now. He has a Facebook page. So that story, which I would like to lay next to what I'm also noticing, which is a kind of what I fear commoditizing of our desire to connect, in that I live in Cincinnati, and we have many fine poets here, a lot of whom have been in my classes, not just as a high school teacher, but in the world I created outside of that. But I'm noticing this compulsion to talk about the number of readings that they're doing, and then they're going to read here, and then they're going to read here, and then the number of books that they self-publish and then email people to buy over and over again. And then there's one coming up soon that's called Hit the Mic. And it's not only about selling your books, but other merchandise at this event. And something about it, I keep thinking, of course, I want these words in the world. I want all voices to be heard. Brett Walls is the name of the poet with Locked-In Condition. And I want Brett's, and I want everybody else's. But the commodification obsession is what I'm feeling and fearing about this. And I don't know if you have a thought or have seen this,
Sure. I mean, I think I don't mind people promoting stuff and selling stuff. Artists have to put bread on the table. So if I can support, I'm always happy to. You don't have to go along. That's the thing. If people are doing it and you don't want to go, don't go. But I'm really glad that people are doing stuff and finding a way where they can share. Some people want to have a much larger platform. Some people are really happy with a small community of readers. There's shape for everybody. But I'm really happy, just like you advertised there, I'm really happy that people find out. Different people will be attracted to that, or other people will go, oh, that's not for me. I like all of those replies.
We're running near the end of our hour, but we do have several more questioners. We'll take at least one more, and that'll be Mike Griswold.
Whoops. Okay, quite wonderful. So my question is, hi, thank you so much. This has been lovely community this afternoon. I find myself in the last 10 years becoming an unintentional poet. It's how I process my life and my spiritual journey, and they just come upon me, and that can be a problem sometimes when I ought to be doing something else maybe. But my main question today is I often share my poems by text. And so, of course, I lay them out and I punctuate them for that medium. And of course, and my thing is that punctuation for me, I never made it very far in grammar. It's just what I think will have someone read it the way I would read it.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that? Because I have a feeling that it's not going to happen that way.
No.
And that may not matter. The imagery itself can speak in any number of ways to people, but I always kind of wonder about the punctuation part.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about really is form and the space within which a person can, in form, like a poetic form, a sonnet, in stanzas, a villanelle, whatever, in a certain sense, try to communicate as much as they're able the way that they wish the poem to be read. And that's a really good thing to do. And I do think it's always worthwhile doing as much as you're able, and know that you'll never be able to do that. People will always find a way to project into the poem something that you may not have wished to be there. Sometimes you might be delighted with what they find. Sometimes you might be embarrassed or offended. That's the nature of art. It's a complicated thing. I have met people who try to control the reception of their art, and they are stressed people. And so therefore, what I'm interested in is the ways within which you can learn more and more how to do everything you're able to make sure that you're not saying anything that you don't wish to say, but also that you're not saying anything that's offensive. And then after that, to find a way to say, well, let's see what people say. Yeah. You'll find all kinds of really interesting books on form. There's some great anthologies. Norton's got a great one on form, which is really worthwhile reading. So
we have to close now, but an hour is far too short amount of time. I've seen so many people in the chat saying how deeply moved they were. Pádraig, thank you so much. And we look forward to the next time we see you at Omega, and we look forward to your next writing.
Yeah,
so thank you so much.
Thank you. Great pleasure to meet you all and to be in the room, and some friends in the room too. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.